Вы знаете, иногда, когда к нам приходят выступать разные люди, ты пытаешься спросить, хобби есть? Хобби нет, говорит, все утро на работе. А вот с Грегом Робинсом ситуация особенная. Я очень рада представить Грега, и все, что можно сказать про Грега, чрезвычайно интересно. Ну, например, дедушка у него родился в Одессе, поэтому Грег у нас влюблен в Россию. Если гуглить Грега Робинса, первое, что выходит, это его песни. И я, когда я еду в аэропорт, я часто слушаю его CD, часть песен на русском, и даже есть ссылки на Булату Акуджаву. Ну, как бы с профессиональной точки зрения Грег чрезвычайно известен в области международных инвестиций. У него прекрасное образование, у него прекрасный рабочий как бы послужной список, назови банк, в каждом банке Грег занимал какую-нибудь руководящую должность. Сейчас Грег фокусируется на своей собственной практике, которая называется Robbins Advising. Он работает с крупнейшими и ведущими организациями в Женеве, как, например, Global Gate. А самое, как бы, когда я вчера разговаривала с Грегом, говорю, Грег, что мне про тебя рассказать? Он мне прислал ссылку на прекрасную детскую книжку, которую он написал во время пандемии. С учетом того, что у меня 3 детей, вот прямо сейчас я ее и куплю. Грег Робинс, over to you.
Спасибо. Спасибо огромное, Ольга. Знаете, что я не был в курсе, в принципе, что сегодня утром будем на русском языке говорить, вот поэтому я просто готов говорить по-английски, и если потом какие вопросы по-русски, с удовольствием. Так что, let me start. Thank you, Olga, for those very, very kind words. Maybe you're right. Maybe music would be more appropriate given this year we've had than business. But I'm gonna talk about business this morning. A thank you as well to Taisia and Vadim and the organizers for putting together this excellent conference. I'm delighted to start it off as best I can to get the energy going. And of course, you know, thank you to all the participants and everybody listening this morning, taking time out and trying to help collectively understand what's going on. And again, I'll do my best to kick things off. It goes without saying that I hope everybody is well and healthy and sane. So those are the 3 things I would wish everybody. So let me get started, and I'll give you a sense of where I'm going. Let's talk big picture about the pandemic. So 3 big things in the pandemic that we can say with some degree of certainty. One is this concentration of state power, importance of states and governments. We've seen that in resounding terms around the world, both for good and for bad. Secondly, big company power. A lot of companies locking in positions, growing. We've seen it in the markets. We've seen it in the business world. And thirdly, turbulence in markets, opportunity, entrepreneurs, families expanding, growing, arriving, and so on. Now, what's interesting is what I've just described is actually not the pandemic we've been living through. That's a description of the 14th century. That's the Black Plague. So that's what happened in Europe over 600 years ago. And those are the key things that came out of that, which is kind of startling. And I mentioned that at the outset. I will talk today about COVID and not about the Black Plague, but just to say, 600 years, it's not the first or the last pandemic we faced as a civilization or as a business. So just to put things in a little perspective. Secondly, I would say that our business, the wealth management business, has been going strong for centuries. It will, I think, continue to do so. It has weathered pandemics, wars, all sorts of ups and downs, depressions, and so on, and it will continue, I believe, to do so. I would also add that I think we're in a business that's quite evolutionary rather than revolutionary. So that will kind of come through in some of my remarks. I think the business will continue to evolve, but in a gradual place. So in terms of today, I'm going to very briefly go through 5 lessons of this pandemic, of COVID, from my perspective, 5 key lessons to take away. Then I'm going to talk about 5 trends over the next decade as a result of that and where we might be heading. And then at the very end, I'll offer a few thoughts for client advisors, which the vast majority of us are in one form or other. So I'll say what I think is pertinent there. So let me get started. COVID-19, what we're all continuing to live through right now. What are 5 things that I've taken away that are relevant to us? 1, wealth. As they say, the rich got richer. That is a message of this year. So while the world has been in a pandemic, many, tens of millions of people have been out of work, markets have had, economies have had problems. In general, wealth has grown over the course of this year. If you want to see more details, look at Credit Suisse's 2020 wealth report. The beginning of the year was tough, as we all know. Q1 was a difficult time. Wealth was not created, but over the course of the year, it's caught up and then some. And for some people, spectacularly so, Jeff Bezos has become the poster boy of wealth creation in the pandemic. It's getting up towards 100 million since March, which is pretty startling. Just to say it has not been equal across the world. China has seen more wealth creation. The UK has actually seen wealth depletion, which is an outlier, but in general across the world it's grown. So that's the first big point. Second big point, as in I mentioned earlier in the Black Plague, big companies with strong balance sheets have done very well through this pandemic, and that's been reflected in the markets. So strong balance sheets, liquidity, those that have benefited from the central bank, those that have had access to cash have generally speaking done very well. We know there's been a number of winners in this pandemic: online businesses, logistics businesses, health businesses, and so on. And there have been some big losers, again, particularly in this year, the most notable being in hospitality, tourism, and travel, which we all sadly know is the case, and we hope that that will return in some form beginning in 2021. So there's certainly hope at the end of this. As again, 600 years ago, the governments are playing a huge role, and that has been so important this year, and we've talked about it. How have they done that? Through stimulus packages, or less so, and through restrictions and all sorts of regulations on the economies, and they've played a major role in how economies have responded and adapted to this crisis. Leadership has been the one important variable around the world. Countries that have had strong leadership, that have not politicized the virus, have done best. So places like Germany, some places in Scandinavia, obviously South Korea, and so on. Some countries have not done well. Sadly, Russia is one of those, and sadly, the US is certainly one of those. So big role of governments. Those of us that watch markets have watched closely when stimulus packages will come, how they will look, and that has had a big impact on how markets have reacted. So with that, let's turn to markets. So investments. My kind of overall take on 2020 for investments with COVID has been what I call fortitude and patience. We have needed to have fortitude and be patient as investors, and for those that have done that, we've been rewarded. So the first beginning of the year, the key issues were managing liquidity and staying invested, and that was not always easy. Managing this perceived opportunity cost. Clients were always feeling they're not getting into the market quickly enough. They're missing out. There's things we're leaving on the table. So some were facing margin calls, some were feeling anxious to get in the market. I think frameworks were helpful, I think, for investing this year. I created a matrix, which was mentioned earlier. I shared that. That's still available, different phases. UBS did some very good scenario planning. I encourage, Mark Hafley and his team, very good work. I encourage people to take a look at that. Another point, search for yield, right? It's been a year where on the one side, there's been tremendous risks and downside to need to protect. On the other side, there's still been a search for some yield. Rates are down at zero, in some cases even in real terms below. And so investors have looked for yield. One of the reasons why equity markets are just sky high. It's been one of the few places to find some return. And again, lastly, risk management. Particularly in the beginning, it was very difficult to see what to do to protect portfolios. Put options were very expensive for those that looked at them earlier in the year. And diversification was really the best thing. So having fortitude and being patient. Lastly, on COVID clients, what was it about this year, we could say, for terms of advising and acquiring clients? Well, Q1 was challenging, as I've mentioned, very difficult situations with margin calls, with bankers not being, in many cases, available to clients, and a lot of lack of clarity of what was to follow. Second big point was the lack of personal interaction, which we have all become accustomed to in our business. We do our business largely in person. That didn't happen so much this year, and I think there's a degree of fatigue associated with that. I think I speak for many when I say we're tired a bit of Zoom. We'd like to actually see people again. And it has particularly been bad for prospecting. So for some existing clients, you can manage with Zoom, but for new clients, what I generally hear and is that it's been a very difficult time to bring people into the fold who you can't meet in person and establish that deep kind of personal connection. So those are my kind of 5 takeaways really for this year. So then to transition, what do we see going forward? What do we see for the next decade? And I realize I'm trying to fit a lot into a very short opening chat here, but that's what I was asked to do, so I will do that. The pandemic, it's often said, is an accelerator of trends. It is accelerating things that are happening today in our business and in our world, and that is certainly true. What I think over the next decade is I think governments will continue, at least for some good period of time, to play an important role in our economies, our lives, and in our business. They'll do that because support will be needed for some ongoing period of time. Many people are dislocated through this crisis. There's a big debt overhang, a huge debt overhang, which will have to be addressed sooner or later. That will lead to taxes being reviewed. It's almost certain at a certain point taxes will go up. Importantly, probably capital gains taxes will be amongst the first to be considered. And inequality will be a big outcome of this, sadly, of this pandemic. So all of these things will lead governments to play a big role. Central banks, I think, will keep rates down for a while, and then we'll have to come back in at a certain point, allow a bit of inflation, but they'll have to come back into the field, and that will allow, again, more yield a little bit on the interest rate side, and it will change a bit the markets, but I don't think that will happen for some time. So going to investments, again, big topic. There will be other people talking at length about this today, but I would say 5 things within the investment point. One, it's generally regarded that returns will be lower over the next decade across the board, at least in public markets. So there will be a big search for yield that will continue. I think decoupling is a big theme, and that will continue to become very important. Decoupling, by which I mean there will be a China and a US axis in the world, and companies will align one way or the other around those axes, 5G being an important kind of point of differentiation there, but there's others. And so I think as we invest and as we look at the world, we have to increasingly take into account how that decoupling will affect our investments to make sure we're hedged properly, having exposure to a Chinese axis, as it were, and a US axis. For those interested, take a look at Ian Bremmer and some of the work he's done. I think it's very good on this topic. 3, growth areas. There will be important growth areas going forward. The ones most talked about are the financial, the technological influence on financial health, and green issues. So fintech, health tech, and kind of green tech. And there's going to be a lot of winners in these areas, and people are actively looking right now to where to take some bets going forward. Private markets, I think, will be a very big topic this next decade, especially for many of our clients. How to find diversification and yield in private equity, private debt, real estate, and getting access to good deals and being outside of the markets. Markets will be expensive, and there'll be need to look outside. The private equity groups are finding tremendous opportunity right now, especially also distressed in this pandemic, and I think it's important to keep track of those. Guys, this is where as advisors we play an important role to help our clients both select and get access to the right things. So I think this is quite important. And lastly, sustainability. Everybody hears about this. This will be a big topic for the next 10 years, both in terms of intentionally investing there and also in finding a lot of value. 3, the wealth industry, what will happen in our business the next 10 years? I think overall our business will be pretty resilient. As I mentioned at the very outset, it has been around for hundreds of years. It's survived wars and crises and pandemics. I think it will continue to kind of muddle through this in a decent way. Consolidation, another buzzword. Every year we hear this at conferences. There's massive consolidation coming. I don't think that will happen. I think there'll be some consolidation. The big players will play on their strengths. I think niches are developing. There will be some in the middle that have neither a niche nor strength that will get marginalized a bit in this. But I think the consolidation story will be a gradual story for some time. And then there's the what I would call the hybrid story of fintech and in-person banking. And I think there's going to be a need to combine those. I don't think you'll see a massive shift to fintech in a way we do our business, nor do I think it will be unimportant. I think it will be, both will be important. Clients, what can we say about clients over the next decade? I think a couple things. I think demographics will change. We're seeing younger clients, we're seeing new preferences coming in, next generations that have different ideas about what they want to do. I think we'll see new dimensions in our business. I think health, not only, but largely because of this pandemic, will become a big consideration with clients, managing physical, mental health, location, safety in life. So I think that will factor in. I think digital health and cybersecurity will become bigger issues for wealthy clients and families. And I think meaning will be very important. I think our clients will increasingly look not only for financial returns, but meaning, doing good, doing well, helping certain causes, contributing to the sustainability of our planet. BCG in its 2020 wealth report, I think very aptly called this financial advisors versus life advisors. And I think there's a lot of truth in that. And I think we need to adapt accordingly. Geography. I think we will return to travel. Please don't quote me on that, but I think 2021 will get back to a more normal travel life. Bill Gates notably predicted that globally business travel would fall to a 50% drop from where it is on a sustained basis. I don't think that will happen in our industry based on my sense and what I hear from people. I don't think we'll cut travel in half. I think in the beginning it might actually increase because people will need to reestablish contacts around the world. And I think another, and again, you will talk about this today, Olga, I know you'll talk about it in the next section, but I think there'll be increasing pressure on offshore centers. So be it Malta, be it Cyprus. I think there will be many considerations for clients in terms of tax, safety, viability, as governments put pressure on other governments for fiscal reasons and others to clamp down a bit on these programs. So I think it will be an interesting decade, and I look forward to hearing what people say about that today. So just to close, what 5 things can I say about us as advisors in light of everything I've just said? I think our role, there's 5 important things, and we know these, and they're not something we learned during the pandemic. But 1, add value. We need to add value. We need to look at things from a number of different angles for our clients, take in this pandemic, understand what it means, and help advise them. You know, I created a checklist earlier in the year to work with my clients. I offered that to everybody. I still offer that. If anybody wants a copy, it can be offered. But to go through a systematic way of looking at the way that this impacts their families, businesses, outlook, investments, and so on. Secondly, we need to stay engaged. We need to be respectful, and we need to have empathy. You know, we are all, whether we're rich or poor, whether we're sick or healthy, we're all in one way or another suffering in this year. And I think it would just go, it would not be appropriate not to mention that we need to think about this for our clients. I've thought about people I should or should not get in touch with. I've thought about how I want to do that. And I've generally erred on the side of less is better than more. That's just been my approach. Be honest, number 3, and transparent. Again, always good advice, especially now. We need to be honest, even if the results are not looking positive, even if there's some problems, we need to be clear so that we can make good decisions with our clients. With that, we need to help protect our clients from themselves. I've seen a lot of clients panic this year. We need to help guide them and to take a long view on things. And that's really my last comment here, which is to play the long game. If I said nothing else today, it would be play the long game with our clients. This business is not about quarterly pipelines, and it's not about pressure to push business development, I don't think. It's about building these long-term relationships with clients, helping them. And if you do that, it tends to work very well. So this is a reason, by the way, that I've become independent. I choose a little bit how I work with clients. I choose a little bit whether I apply pressure. I've chosen this year not to do that. I've chosen to step back a bit. I hope in 2021 to get back out there and play a more active role in the markets. With that, I'm going to stop there. I hope that this has, kind of gotten things going in a good direction. I hope I've thrown out some ideas for thought. I've probably raised more questions than I've answered. But for those that have questions, I know we don't have a lot of time. I'm going to be around during the conference. Reach out to me. We can have a chat. We can meet separately. We can correspond. With that, I turn back to Olga, and I thank everybody for their time. And
thank you, Greg. Before we let you go, and by the way, lots of extremely interesting points, and I think any of the points which you mentioned, at least 10, I've counted, requires separate discussion probably, and probably over a glass of wine in person. But look, I want to ask you one question after this. You mentioned Bill Gates, and I became, during the pandemic, a big fan of podcasts, and I'm listening now. He has this weekly discussions with Rashida Jones where he invites different people. And last week, when he was talking to Yuval Harari, he said that he's often asked the question, what else we need to wait, given that he predicted, as you mentioned, pandemic back in 2015. He said, well, we are underestimating bioterrorism. Now, what I'm trying to ask here is not so much to bring a scary point of a horror film into a discussion, but more into what do you think is going to happen to capital markets, even, well, if this pandemic will continue for a bit longer, or if there is another. We all know that capital markets responded surprisingly well to what's happening in the world and what's happening to businesses. So what's your short-term prognosis of the capital markets should things will go well, and what will happen if this pandemic will gradually move into another one? Are we expecting a crash at some point? Sorry, it's a big question, I know, but...
Okay, well, thank you, Olga. I'm happy to address it. I think one of the things that's come out of this pandemic, and Bill Gates maybe was getting at it, and Harari, who's obviously a very, very bright person, I'm sure took a long perspective, is we look at the fragility in our lives and in our markets. We are very fragile. It is very easy for things to tip and move and change. I'd actually love to talk about the bigger question, but I'll go to your specific question on markets. I think that the prognosis for markets is reasonably positive. And why is that? Because I think the unknowns are much more decreased at the moment. You know, I spoke about this earlier in the year about what the pandemic meant. And the way I described it was, think of it as a numerator and a denominator. The denominator is all the things that are possible to happen, right? This whole range of scenarios, some of which are very troubling. And the numerator is our degree of understanding and what we know. So if that's a small fraction, it suggests there's a lot of uncertainty, right? And as the numerator grows and we get closer to 1, we feel better, right? When all of us, when we invest in markets, we want to feel like at least we have some understanding of what's going to happen, right? And so I would suggest that over the course of the year, a lot of the unknowns have become known. We didn't know whether a vaccine, for example, was possible. We didn't know whether, if it was possible, it would take 5 years or 10 years. In the end, we learned it was both possible and much sooner to appear than we might have thought. And so many different other treatments became more known and clear. So while this pandemic has been horrific and more really than we can all bear, it has at least become clear. So what does that mean for markets? It means when we look out going into 2021, we don't have particular fears that there's going to be an outbreak we haven't seen. We start to see where it's going to. We have a sense that there could be some end to it. We have a sense that there's vaccines coming, that could bring us back to some new normal, whatever that will be, you know, as we talked about. The government, the big variables we haven't known about are things like stimulus packages. As I mentioned, a lot of this year has been sitting and watching what the US Congress does, which is not a particularly fun activity for anybody these days, but we watch them and we're hopeful now that there'll be some stimulus package. There's hope that a Biden administration will bring some leadership, stability. So I think that some of the unknowns have moved away, so I don't foresee a particularly difficult entry to 2021 in capital markets. I think yields will come down a little bit and stabilize. But if you look at, again, UBS, the really outlier down scenarios have been largely moved off the table, and we've moved more to a middle to an upside scenario. I could be completely wrong. If I am, please don't replay this video at the next conference a year from now. but I think there's a lot of reason to hope. I think the one variable that could upset markets a lot is China, U.S.-China relations. I think if that goes really in the wrong direction, it could lead to some difficulties in markets. But I think that's the one big one, assuming the vaccines do work and we do get back to normal. I hope that at least answers.
Thank you so much, Greg. Thanks to you, we are really succeeding in achieving our objective number one, which is making it somewhat light and positive. So we're clearly giving a positive message to the audience.